Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
Alex, given the findings of the Brereton report, is the writing on the wall for Ben Roberts-Smith?
Well, no, it's not. The Brereton report was an administrative report by the military, and so their findings are administrative in the sense that they're on the balance of probability, so which is more likely than not. And it's now up to them, or to the Office of the Special Prosecutor, who's sort of been set up under their auspices, to prove beyond reasonable doubt that one or more of those killings happened and that Ben Roberts-Smith was involved in them. So that's a much higher burden of proof.
Now, we've all seen the defamation case play out on our TV screens. Did Ben Roberts-Smith make things worse for himself by taking the civil action that he did?
Yes, I think he certainly did. I'm a litigation lawyer by trade, and one of my mottos is sometimes the best litigation is the one you didn't run. And I think he'd be regretting running this at the moment, although there is a sort of a complexity to it in the sense that now that everyone sort of heard the Ben Roberts-Smith defamation case was so widely publicised that I wonder how he's going to get a fair trial in Australia, because so many people have an opinion on it or know so much about it already. It'd be hard to get a jury that was completely fair-minded or open-minded about his guilt or otherwise.
Do you think that the defence might go down that track?
Yes, I think they will. There's things you can do to deal with that. You know, you can be very careful in your jury pool selection. You can give directions to the jury. I think the trial will proceed nevertheless, because I think it's such an important case that it'll need to be tried by a jury. And I think they'll be able to select a jury, carefully, and then to give them directions to forget about what they might have heard.
Alex, will this be hard to prosecute, given that there's no crime scene, there's no bodies, there's no guns or bullets?
Yes. So it'll be extremely hard to prosecute. It was extremely hard even in the case of the defamation case, because at the time the Taliban weren't in control of Afghanistan, so they were able to go over there and they were able to look at crime scenes and they were able to get Afghan witnesses to come to Australia or to give evidence on video link. But all of that's not possible now with the changes in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's a long way away. They're not able to go there and look at, blood splatter or look at bodies or look at, take measurements of crime scenes and so on. And also the burden of proof is so much higher. To say something's more likely than not to have happened is one thing, and it's, relatively easy. You just say, well, which do I think is more believable? Whereas to prove a war crime or to prove the crime of war crime murder, you need to prove beyond reasonable doubt. So that there needs to be so much evidence that you couldn't reasonably doubt that he was involved in those murders one way or another. And so I think that's a very high bar.
Will the prosecution be relying mainly on testimony from Ben Roberts-Smith's colleagues in the SAS?
Yes. Well, in a defamation case, there were a lot of witnesses, something like 40 witnesses, and some of them were his colleagues who were on the scene with him, and some of them were Afghan civilians, and some of them were Afghan prisoners. What was remarkable about in the defamation case was that people who had not spoken to each other at all, so people who were, one person might have been an Afghanistan civilian, another person might be an Australian soldier who'd never met, and their evidence was very similar, very consistent with the allegations that he was involved in the murders. So to have that kind of that consistency of evidence was very damning for Ben Roberts-Smith, because hard to imagine that everyone's made it up. And so I think he'll face the same issue if they can get those same witnesses, which they may be able to.
Yeah. Alex, I can't quite remember how this started. Did it come from whistleblowers in the SAS regiment?
Yes, it did. So the original, people, I think Ben Roberts-Smith was very well respected, and you can understand why, but it's people in his own, that were under his command, who have given evidence against him, which is fairly damning. So people who are in the same, they say in the heat of war, things are different than they are in normal life, and I can totally understand that. But the people who were giving evidence against him primarily were the people who were working with him in the same heat of war situation and with the same kind of background and the same training and all of that. And so it is pretty worrying that his own people are giving evidence against him. And then the rest of the evidence came from Afghan civilians who were brought out for the defamation trial. And then there was some media reports, very famous media reports about it. And then the Brereton report as well, which was an independent military commission. So there's a whole bunch of sources, if you like, of evidence in this. But the Brereton report and the media reports were really the two key findings, and they all came from evidence from SAS soldiers and from Afghan civilians.
You would think that if the actions did take place, that it must have been pretty bad for the SAS soldiers to actually break ranks and come out and blow the whistle.
Right, that's right. I think when people initially heard of this case, they thought, oh, well, look, it's pretty tough to charge a soldier with murder who's fighting in, the heat of battle, the haze of bullets flying everywhere and all that sort of stuff, and it's they're there to kill the enemy. So you can understand, I think the initial feeling was, well, that Ben Roberts-Smith, it's pretty tough to charge a soldier with murder. But then the reality is his own troops were saying, well, these are people who were under our control, they were tied up, they were unarmed, or sometimes they were never armed in the first place, and guns were planted. That was the allegation, guns were planted to make it look like they were armed. And so when their own soldiers are saying, look, this goes well beyond what we find acceptable conduct when you're dealing with someone who's under your control, who's not armed, who's not a threat, then it's pretty damning evidence, I think. And then when you've got the Afghan civilians who come out and say, yeah, I saw the same thing, then when there were measurements of the battlefield and so on, which in Ben Roberts-Smith's account don't make sense, just weren't physically accurate, and whereas they were accurate in terms of the prosecution case or the defence in the defamation case, then I think the evidence is it's overwhelming in the sense that, in terms of beyond reasonable doubt, I don't know, but certainly there's overwhelming evidence that he was involved in those 5 murders.
It's going to be very interesting to see how it all plays out. Alex, thank you very much for your expertise on this today.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
Alex Martin is a partner at Taurus Lawyers, Melbourne.